College Dublin. We were founded in 1854 as the Catholic University of Ireland, under, as I say, John Henry Newman as our first rector. And the buildings you see in this picture were the buildings where the university was first founded. And we still possess these buildings today. So we still have some of the original lecture theatres of the university. But these buildings far predate the setting up of the university. They started their lives as Georgian townhouses for very rich, I think, English people who were living in Dublin and making money out of Ireland at the time. Now, I think that there is a shared history between India and Ireland in this respect. But by the time 1854 came around, the two townhouses which you see in this picture, so the lights can be dimmed a bit. It's not showing up very well. Anyway, you can kind of see a tall townhouse on the right of this picture, and then a shorter one on the left. These have been combined together with an infill building on the left, which was built in Victorian times, and this was where University College Dublin was actually set up. Now, just to think back, it's all very well to look at those buildings now and say, oh, it was established in 1854. So what did Dublin look like in 1854? And the engravings actually that I have here give you a little bit of an impression of Dublin in the 1850s. So you can see the port on the right-hand side here. Many of these ships are still sailing ships, although some of them have steam and sail. And you can see the customs house, which still features on the Dublin horizon. Up here you can see the square in what is now O'Connell Street, and you can see there that there are horses and buggies, people walking around. There is no mechanisation of any form there at that time. There is one gas light, you might see in the picture, so Dublin at that time was lit through gas. So this is the Dublin of John Henry Newman's time. And it's interesting when one looks. John Henry Newman wrote a book called The Idea of a University, which is still in print today. You can still buy it. People still talk about his ideas at the university. But one has to remember that those ideas were constructed in a time where much of the technology which we take for granted today absolutely did not exist. So here's John Henry Newman on the left, and if you think of the technologies that were coming in his time, so the ship which is on the right is the Great Eastern. In fact, Great Eastern was built in 1859. Brunel was the engineer that put together the Great Eastern, so those engineers in the class will perhaps come across Brunel's name. He was responsible for many of the early engineering projects in the UK. So this was the first great steamship, and it was designed such that it could carry enough coal to get it from the UK to Australia. I'm not sure it ever made that. That's better. You can actually see that now. But what you can also see in this picture is that the other boats around it are sailing ships. So in the 1850s, 1860s, right through to the 1900s, there was still much of the world trade that was being carried by sailing ships. At the same time, the world was starting to be connected through communications. And what you can see at the bottom right here is the telegraph stations. So in John Henry Newman's time, for the first time, it was possible to send messages in real time from one side of the Atlantic to the other. And in fact, around the world, major cities of the world were starting to be connected up with the telegraph. Now, it did require people to tap out messages in Morse code, and for someone on the other end, hence two pictures here, listening to that Morse code and translating it back. But it was the beginning of the global communication system that we see today. Now, if we move through to the turn of the century, and it was mentioned that James Joyce is considered by many to be the father of the modern novel. James Joyce attended UCD between 1898 and 1902. And what we have here in the picture is a picture of James Joyce's class as they came to graduation. James Joyce is actually the gentleman just up here on the left. It looks like he's got something on his head, but it's a glitch in the photograph there. And you can see him in his later days over to the right. So James Joyce has really set the stage for modern literature, and particularly in terms of the modern novel and the modern short story. But by that time, this is what Dublin looked like. So this is a photograph now, and you'll see that as we went from the 1850s, where the pictures were engravings, by the 1900s, then we have photographs of what went on. You can see in 1909, when what was the Catholic University of Ireland became a secular college of the National University of Ireland, named University College Dublin, then Dublin was much busier. You can still see some of the central landmarks, and in fact, if you go and stand on this bridge today, it's still very recognizable by the buildings. But you can see that the technology, though it has advanced since the 1850s, we now have trams, but these trams still being drawn by horses. Now, a few years after this photo was taken, then the tram system was electrified. The same trams still run, but in electrified form. So you can see that the technology is expanding, that the connectivity then between countries is expanding. And at the same time, not long after that picture was taken, we see, as I mentioned, we had Indian students coming to UCD to study law, and B.B. Geary was amongst them. Now, it's important to say that at that time, Ireland was still part of the British Empire, but there was a strong movement towards independence of Ireland, and that Republican movement, the people that were involved in that Republican movement, many of them were attending UCD, and B.B. Geary and some of the other Indian law students got involved in some of the discussions around republicanism at that time, which in the end led to B.B. Geary and others being expelled from the country. So unfortunately, we can't claim B.B. Geary as a graduate of University College Dublin, because although he studied there, he was expelled from the country before he could graduate. But it's interesting to see that at that point in time, there was such a connection between our two countries that we had significant numbers of Indian students studying with us. But in a world that still required for those students to get to Dublin, they had to go on these steamships and spend weeks effectively at sea getting there. Now, from those routes, UCD, given that it had a central part in the building of the Irish state, has now become Ireland's largest university. And as the ambassador said, there's a little bit of competition between ourselves and Trinity College Dublin, because Trinity College Dublin was very much, when University College Dublin was set up as the Catholic University of Ireland, Trinity College Dublin, being much older, had Protestant roots very much associated with the British Empire, and so there was a natural tension there. Since the early 1900s, both have been nominally secular, and increasingly they are genuinely secular, but there's still a traditional rivalry that's picked up in the ambassador's talk between the two. So we can say without doubt that Trinity College Dublin is the oldest university in Ireland. We can also say without doubt that University College Dublin is the largest university in Ireland, and which is the best, as the ambassador said, remains a topic of active discussion. But in terms of where we've grown to from Newman's little university in those houses I showed you on St. Stephen's Green, we're now in the top 1% of universities globally. We have over 33,500 students, almost 30,000 of those in Dublin. We have significant numbers of international students with us in Dublin. We have over 5,500 students we're also teaching overseas. So we would also say that we're the most globally engaged university in Ireland. So growing from those roots in a pre-Republican Catholic University of Ireland to become University College Dublin, Ireland's most globally engaged university. We're now the first choice for Irish students coming to university. We're number one in Ireland for research funding and for research publications. So there has been an absolute transformation since that 1909 when you saw James Joyce in his class there in Dublin, and where we are now as a international university, so a member of the International Association of Universities, where I sit on the board, member of the Worldwide Universities Network, Universities 21. So we have now a world that has changed very significantly from the time of the establishment of the university. And I want to now talk about three of those changes in particular. So the first one is globalization. And when we go back to John Henry Newman's time, as I said, cities were for the first time being connected together by telegraph. Ships could take significant quantities of goods and people between ports, but the time taken was very significant. Top picture here with all the green lines shows you the air traffic now in the world in a single day. So you can see that now the world is totally connected in terms of moving people and goods right the way around the world. The pictures I put around it an indication that the mobile phone network now reaches into virtually every corner of the world. There are more mobile phones in the world now than there are people. And so it doesn't matter where you go, in Brazil, in Africa, anywhere here in India, you'll have connectivity to this global network using protocols which are the same throughout the world. And this has led to a globalization which I'd say now we have a single human civilization in a way that we didn't have in John Henry Newman's time. In John Henry Newman's time, there was the British Empire, there was China had its little empire, there was the Japanese Empire, there was still a range of empires. Africa was shared between different empires, but now we're in a situation where those boundaries are gone. We're now connected together, we can move relatively freely across the world, and we can basically make touch with any human being anywhere in the world, providing we know their mobile phone number. So that's the first. That's the first very significant change that's happened since John Henry Newman's time. Now, the second change that I want to talk about is the massification of higher education. So, in John Henry Newman's time, a very small proportion of the population had the privilege to study at university. It was very much the domain of the elite. Just a very few percentage of the population managed to get that opportunity. But what has happened over the last 150 years since that time is that more and more of the population have the opportunity to come and study at institutions like this. And that's been as a result of the Industrial Revolution that was underway in John Henry Newman's time and has worked through to a mechanisation of labour, a mechanisation of means of production, which means that today there are far more people that can spend the years required to come to university and to study. The lines on this graph show you a number of different countries and the increase in enrollment in tertiary education in those countries. So the top one is North America. You can see the purple line. North America was probably the first country to really have that massification of their higher education system and the increased emphasis on virtually everyone getting a university degree or at least a diploma. Now, the next line down, the yellow one, is Ireland. And you can see that since 1970, the proportion of the Irish population enrolled in higher education has increased dramatically. So from 10% in 1970 to almost 80% as it stands now. The increase in participation in higher education in Ireland has been one of the highest increases anywhere in the world. You can see that increase is reflected in Europe. That's the green line below it. So Europe has traditionally had a reasonably high participation rate, but that has gone up significantly in recent years as well. In terms of India, India is the upper green line down at the bottom here. You can see that participation rate was quite low. Remembering you have a very large population, but in recent times that participation rate has gone up quite significantly to be above 20%. For a population of your size, that's an extraordinary number of people in higher education. Now those are the enrollment rates. The second graph I've got reflects then the proportion of the population that will be educated to degree level. And these are projected forward to 2050. You can see that Ireland is featuring up at the top there again, the yellow line, along with Singapore and South Korea, as having the biggest proportion of its population educated to degree level by 2050. But again, there are very significant increases coming for all the countries here, including India, which these projections show the total number of the population being educated to degree level to be reaching around 20% by 2050. So this is a major difference now in the way that universities work. Instead of just educating the elite and being able to do whatever the elite want to do, universities are now educating the majority of the world's population, or at least they will be by 2050. And that means you have to think very seriously about that education and how that education is preparing people for the future. Now the third change, remember we've gone through, first change is globalization, the second change is the massification of the university system. The third change, and this is an incomplete change, but it's the recognition of the value of diversity and inclusion. So I put it in this slide. On the top left, this is James Joyce's class back in 1909. You can see there's a certain sameness to the people in that class. They're all male, they're all white, and judging by their dress, they're all of a certain background. If you look to the picture I have on the right, this would be typical at many global university campuses. If you walk around University College Dublin, you'll see pictures like this. Many of the main US, UK, Australia, New Zealand universities. The diversity is extraordinary. And around the world, the value of that diversity is being recognized. So there's increasing evidence that companies that have a diversity of people at senior management level and board level do better. And that's research that's being conducted around the world, but also research that's being conducted in the US, a country that at the moment one would think, based on the politics, is starting to push back against globalization and diversity. Yet the evidence shows very clearly that the companies in the US that have diversity in their senior management and at board level actually do better. So this is the third change. The classes basically look very different from Joyce's time. Now, constants. So your provost referred to evolution, but there are certain things which have remained steadfastly the same since Newman's time. And if you think about the university journey, as you're sitting here in this lecture theatre, just as James Joyce sat in the lecture theatre in Newman House, just across from St. Stephen's Green in 1909, that you'll be participating, I'm sure, in small group tutorials such as shown on the right here. You'll be sitting examinations, maybe in a venue that looks like that. Certainly we have examination venues looking like this at UCD, and in the end you'll be given a certificate by your university that will certify that you have personally met a certain level of standard in a particular journey of higher education. So despite many pundits predicting the downfall of the traditional universities, there are more people enrolled in traditional universities today than ever before, and the majority of those people are undertaking this same journey that the students that were present in Newman's time in the university in what was then the Catholic University of Ireland undertook. So this has been a remarkably persistent form of higher education. And while people keep saying, well, artificial intelligence is going to put an end to all of that, then I'm regularly at different countries around the world talking to audiences of other university leaders who have traveled extraordinary distances to sit in the same room and listen to lectures that could have just as easily been podcasted. But there is a difference to sitting at home and watching something on the computer as opposed to being together in a room like this, even if the information being transmitted is the same. I'll come back to that. So the second constant that I'd like to just point out since Newman's time is open and critical scientific, and by that I also include social scientific investigation and peer-reviewed publication. So what you see on the left here is perhaps the first learned journal ever published. It's the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, published in 1667, and it covered the years 1665 and 1666. So this was the first set of scientific investigations that were published in a rigorous sense in a journal that then became a regular publication. The graph on the right of that slide shows you the extraordinary rate of increase in peer-reviewed publication that has happened since those times. But the thing is that this is a mode of discovery, publication, of knowledge being developed around the world and shared around the world in such a way that human knowledge can progress. And this is something which hadn't happened significantly in history before that time. Everything that you see, all of the technologies that I referred to, are actually a product of this repeated improvement of understanding that results from knowledge being shared, from knowledge being tested, from then that triggering advance in thinking in someone else. So this is a significant constant that remains and will remain as far as I can see. Now, the third constant, and this comes down a little bit to why I said it's great to have a mixed audience here of social scientists and engineers. There has been since Newman's time, and probably long before that, a debate on the value of a broad liberal arts education versus a useful education like an engineering degree. John Henry Newman, as I mentioned, in his days in Dublin, wrote a book called The Idea of a University. Much of that book is dedicated to defending the value of what's now known as a liberal arts education, a broad education that prepares someone to take their place in society, to be able to have discourse on the main ideas of the time. And at the time of John Henry Newman, the traditional universities like Oxford, which is where Newman came from, were being threatened by the new universities that were more science engineering based. So that debate continues today, and you can see it in things like the quote from Stephen Jobs here, where he says that technology alone is not enough. It's technology married with liberal arts that yields us the result that makes our hearts sing. So Jobs was a big proponent of the value of having both the arts and the sciences together. But it's a debate that continues to this day. You can see in the US currently very significant questioning of the value of liberal arts education. So that's the third constant. Now, I said that I'll talk about a number of challenges. And the first challenge I want to talk about is the increasing virtualization of the learning journey. As I said, one of the constants is that university is still in many senses as it was in Newman's time. You come, you listen to lectures, you participate in tutorials, you take examinations. That is changing in some universities, and more and more of the content is being placed online. Increasingly, lectures are being taped or they're being captured and they're being then broadcasted in podcasts. Some universities have taken the policy decision that all lectures are to be captured and to be available on the web. And what some of those universities have seen is dramatic falling in attendance. So that lecturers are turning up into classrooms like this, and there'll be a scattering of students. Most of them will be off doing their sports or their part-time jobs. And that really detracts from the educational experience. And I'll come back again to why that might be the case. But I think that this is something that we really have to face up to the challenge. Well, how can we best couple technology with what is best about traditional university education? And here's perhaps why it's a significant challenge. And that's because as we have this rise in technology, in computers that can do your engineering calculations for you, that can analyze your structures in a way that when I was an engineering student sitting in the place of some of you, then we'd spend hours doing calculations to analyze fairly simple structures. Now all those calculations can be done in milliseconds on a computer. So the hard skills, which is on the left-hand side of the brain, left-hand side of the slide, I should say, which universities have traditionally concentrated on, are becoming less and less important in terms of your role as you go out and take your place in society. An understanding of those hard skills is important, but increasingly what employers are looking for is the soft skills. So things like collaboration, communication, creativity, problem solving. Increasingly when I talk to employers, CEOs of major companies in Ireland, they say that the soft skills are what they're looking for in terms of future employees, because they know that the technology is taking care of a lot of the calculations that used to be done by graduates from universities. So this, I think, is a real challenge. Traditionally, universities have said that they develop soft skills, but we don't generally assess the soft skills. What we assess are the hard skills, the technical skills, to ensure that you have mastery of your subject matter. And to go back, then the sort of skills that you develop in an environment like this are not just absorbing what the lecturer is telling you, but you develop the soft skills by working with your colleagues when you do group projects, when you do presentations, when you just have discussion around topics. And if you virtualize the learning experience in the university such that people are not getting together physically, actually what you're doing is reducing then the development of the soft skills. So if our students are not engaging with our universities, the amount that we're developing soft skills is actually reducing at a time when the employers are telling us that the soft skills are more and more important. So I think this is a challenge to the traditional universities. You see at the moment, and I put a couple of illustrations down the right-hand side, where third-party trainers are coming up with products to try to take advantage of the gap in the marketplace there and to give soft skills training outside of a university environment. I think the challenge for us as universities is to work out how we can formally develop those soft skills within a university education and certify them in the same way that we do for the hard skills, and to stop that from moving out of the university sector, because there's a danger that if